You've probably heard Seattle's transit expansion costs $54 billion, but that number is wrong and the real one is even bigger. And that's just one of several new state laws changing who has the edge in this real estate market right now. If you're buying, selling, or investing here, this changes your strategy. By the end of this video, you'll know what these new rules mean for your next move. You may not have looked at Seattle real estate this way before, but for many properties here, the land under the house may be the most valuable part. For decades, the city ran on one basic idea: one house, one lot, and anything more needed a special exception. That idea is gone. From 2023 to 2026, Washington passed a handful of major housing laws. Seattle updated its zoning code to match them, and Sound Transit connected the east side to Seattle by light rail for the first time in the region's history. Three things happened at once, and now buyers, sellers, and appraisers are starting to look at the same address in a new way. I want to clear this up now because some of what you'll hear online gets this completely wrong. Single-family zoning did not go away. The city changed its residential zoning so that at least 4 housing units are allowed on most lots, with up to 6 near major transit stops. That is a real change, but it's not a free-for-all. Some lots still have limits that keep them looking the way they do today. Quick note before we get into the law that started all of this. If you're sitting on a property here in Seattle and wondering what your specific lot can support under these new rules, that's the kind of question I help people work through. I'll give you a straight read on your lot's potential with no pressure involved. My contact info is in the description below if you want to talk specifics. Now let's get into the laws themselves. 1 house per lot used to be the rule. It is not anymore. 4 is the big number here. That's how many housing units are now legally allowed on a big share of residential lots. That change comes from HB 1110, a 2023 state law most people call the Middle Housing Law. Now get close enough to a major transit stop and that number jumps all the way to 6. The city's permanent vision of this zoning became effective at the start of the year, replacing an interim rule that had been in place for about 6 months before that. The new code allows duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, even small townhome-style projects on lots that used to allow 1 house and maybe a small cottage out back. You might already be wondering what this means for a lot near a transit stop. That's coming up, but let's finish the zoning picture first. Before you picture buildings with 6 units popping up on every block, listen to what the architects and developers building this stuff are saying. Most of what gets built under these new rules looks like detached townhomes, the same style you've probably seen going up in Ballard or Fremont. A 6-plex is legally possible, but the math on a single residential lot rarely works that way, at least not yet. There are still real limits. Height caps, setback rules, tree protection rules, and lot coverage limits all still apply. So a lot that allows 4 units on paper might not fit 4 units once you account for a protected heritage tree in the backyard, or maybe even a sewer line that needs upgrading. These are the rules on paper. What they mean for a real buyer is a different conversation. This all sounds like zoning talk until you see how it changes the way a real buyer looks at a property. Think about a buyer in South Lake Union scrolling listings on their lunch break, then closing the app and telling themselves they're not ready yet. They're right in the middle of all that Amazon campus energy going back and forth on whether now is the time to buy something of their own. The ADU rules change how that buyer looks at the numbers. Under the old rules, buying a starter home meant carrying the full mortgage by yourself. Under the new rules I'm about to walk you through, buying a property with an existing or buildable second unit means you could live in one part and bring in income from the other. That can help offset what you're paying every month, and that can affect your qualification for a mortgage. Real estate people call that house hacking, and the idea is not new. Washington just made it easier to pull off. So for a first-time buyer with a modest budget looking mostly in condo-heavy South Lake Union, this may not seem like it applies at first. But whether this works comes down to the property, not just the neighborhood, and the rules that make it possible are about to get specific. All right, the backyard cottage just became a real financial instrument. Same backyard cottage, 2 different rule books. Under the old one, you had to live on site, you could only build one, and you could never sell it separately from the main house. All 3 of those limits are gone. Under the new statewide ADU law, you can now build 2 accessory units on most residential lots. That could mean 1 attached unit, 1 detached unit, or even 2 separate structures out back. You no longer have to live on the property yourself, and one of the biggest changes is that an ADU can now be turned into a condo and sold as its own legal property. There's an even newer option too. The city's updated code allows a detached ADU to be split onto its own legal lot, separate from the main house. One thing to be careful with here is that this is still a live legal question. Recent changes to Washington's unit lot subdivision rules appear to still be working through implementation, and Seattle has signaled it may continue to limit the use of that process for ADUs specifically. So if you're considering a unit lot subdivision, talk to a real estate attorney before you commit, because this piece is still being sorted out. The height limit on these units also went up, giving builders more room to work with than the old rules allowed. That opens the door to real livable second units instead of cramped afterthoughts. Now, I want to be straight with you about the catch, because I'm not going to pretend this is a shortcut. Expect somewhere in the low six figures. For a smaller attached unit, a full detached cottage can climb well into the mid six figures. That's $400,000, $500,000. That is entirely possible what it may cost depending on the size of the cottage and the specs. And the process from planning to move in takes a better part of a year, sometimes longer once you factor in permitting. All right, so back to that South Lake Union buyer. If they buy a property with room for a second unit near good transit access and the numbers work for that specific lot, they're not just buying a home. They're buying a mortgage offset and down the road, a legal path to sell that second unit separately if they want to. That's an exit option buyers didn't have 5 years ago. That's the theory. Where the lot sits determines whether any of it pencils out. So all right, if it's near light rail, the development math is different. What if the smallest, oddest shaped lot on your block became one of the more interesting properties in the neighborhood? Under the new rules, developers no longer have to set aside parking for middle housing or ADUs within about a half mile of a major transit stop. That one change can make a tough lot easier to build on. A major transit stop doesn't just mean a light rail station though. Rapid ride bus lines count too, so does commuter rail. That half-mile zero parking zone is bigger than many homeowners realize, and it builds on something the city already had in place for its designated urban centers before this law passed. In March, Sound Transit finished connecting Bellevue and Redmond to Seattle by light rail for the first time in the region's history, with more than 60 miles of track now running across the whole system. Bellevue home values already sit above $1.4 million on average, and that new cross-lake connection is changing how buyers look at small or oddly shaped lots near those stations. I have active buyers targeting properties near these transit stops, betting that proximity will pay off the same way it has in the past. Capitol Hill homes are going pending in around 20 days on average, and that neighborhood has shown a clear light rail premium for years. I do want to correct something you may have heard, including for me. You may have heard that Seattle's transit expansion represents something like $64 billion in infrastructure spending. That number isn't right anymore. Sound Transit's original 2016 ballot measure came in closer to $54 billion, and costs have already climbed by a lot since then, with current estimates for the full regional build-out now well above $100 billion. One more caution here, not every future station helps you today. West Seattle and Ballard both have light rail extensions coming, but Ballard isn't expected to open for well over a decade, with costs that have already climbed by a lot, so much that it's been shelved by the city council. Buying near those future stations is a bet on potential, not a guarantee. West Seattle home values have climbed on their own merits, even without the station being open yet. Proof that transit isn't the only force at work here. The neighborhoods that are always most desirable for reasons other than transit will continue to be desirable. There's a much bigger plan steering all of this growth, and large pieces of it are still being finalized. There's a document sitting in City Hall that could affect your block more than any single law we've covered so far, and most homeowners have never opened it. It's called the One Seattle Plan, the city's official 20-year roadmap for growth, adopted at the end of 2025 and in effect since January 2026. This plan expects the city to add well over 100,000 new housing units over the next 2 decades. The next phase of this plan, the part that decides exactly which neighborhoods get rezoned and by how much, is still working its way through City Council as I'm recording this. There's also a pending court ruling that could complicate parts of the timeline. If an agent or an influencer tells you exactly what's allowed in a specific up-and-coming neighborhood today, take that with a grain of salt. If your property sits near a transit route or one of these new growth areas, expect more development interest heading your way, sometimes before a for sale sign ever goes up. Whether that's good news depends on which side of the deal you're on. And before any of it plays out, there's a conversation with your agent that now has to happen earlier than it used to. One change on this list has nothing to do with zoning, and it may affect more people watching this video than every housing law we've covered combined. It changes how that first conversation with your agent has to go. Since January 2024, Washington has required a written agreement between a buyer and their agent before that agent can start working for them. That means touring homes, pulling comps, or drafting an offer. Before that law, you could spend months working with an agent, getting advice, and touring properties without putting anything in writing. That era is over. Before I can give you real advice on a property or take you through a showing, we need to talk about how I'm representing you, whether that's exclusive, and how compensation works. That agreement has to spell out how long we're working together, whether I'm representing only you, or what happens if a situation arises where I could represent both sides, and what you're agreeing to pay. If a builder's on-site agent is showing you a new construction home, that agent represents the seller, not you, unless both sides agree in writing to something different. I know that sounds more formal than what you might expect from a first meeting with an agent, but it doesn't mean buyers are paying more. It doesn't mean agents have become harder to work with. It just means a conversation about who's representing you happens earlier instead of 3 months into house hunting when it's almost an afterthought. One more piece worth knowing, compensation for the buyer's agent is fully negotiable now, and the seller is not required to cover any of it. If the seller doesn't, that cost either gets negotiated into your offer or comes directly from you. It just moves an honest conversation earlier, which is more than you can say for how this state handles some of its tax rules. All right, in real practice, while this sounds a lot different, in our Seattle East Side markets, most sellers continue to offer compensation towards the buyer's agent up front. A good agent will go over this with you right away. All right, now let's talk about the Washington tax rules and what's real and what isn't. Let's clear this up because I've heard this part get twisted more than almost anything else in this whole conversation. Washington has no state income tax. That part is true, and it's still one of the biggest draws for people moving here from states like California or Oregon. But Washington does have an estate tax, and I want to correct something you may have heard framed as zero, anything on that front. There's no state estate income tax for most people. What exists in the state tax on wealth passed down after someone dies. The exemption on that tax was recently raised to $3 million. So unless an estate is worth more than that, most homeowners' families won't ever deal with this tax. Washington also has a capital gains tax. If you're a homeowner, real estate sales are completely exempt from it. Then there's the so-called millionaire's tax, which was signed into law earlier this year. This one applies to household income above $1 million a year, and it doesn't take effect until 2028. It has nothing to do with home sale proceeds, which are carved out and exempt. And there are many lobbyists opposing this tax, some calling it illegal, some more to come on whether it actually takes effect or not. So keep that in mind, because at the end, I'll break down what this means if you're buying, selling, or holding on to what you've got. So yes, Washington is still one of the more tax-friendly places for people moving here. It's just not as simple as the version you may see online. The tax picture gets clearer once you know what's real, but the housing market itself looks very different depending on which corner of the city you're standing in. You just need to know that not every part of Seattle is on the same track. In Wallingford or Ballard, homes are getting multiple offers within days of hitting the market. Just a few miles away in South Lake Union, condo listings can sit quiet for weeks with barely a showing. Same city, same laws, very different moods. That's something I tell every client who reaches out to me. Single-family homes in the right neighborhoods are still moving fast. In the most desirable neighborhoods north of the Ship Canal, like Ballard, Wallingford, Phinney Ridge, Ravenna, the list goes on, I'm seeing buyers regularly waive their inspection and financing contingencies again on homes, something that had disappeared for a bit. Nearly a quarter of pending sales in the region are seeing more than one offer, and well-priced homes in places like Fremont and Bryant are pending at close to full asking price. The condo market is a different story, and it's still tough. Inventory in that segment is well above what we're seeing in single-family homes. Prices have pulled back compared to last year, and properties are sitting in the market longer, especially older towers downtown, Lower Queen Anne, and South Lake Union. South Lake Union sits right in the middle of that condo slowdown, which brings us back to the same buyer one more time. If they're shopping in that segment, you've got real leverage, more inventory, more time to think, and more room to negotiate than a buyer would have had 2 or 3 years ago. The catch is understanding HOA health and building quality, because not every condo building in that price range is holding its value the same way. So the market isn't just up or down, it depends on what you own and where it is. What you should do next depends on which side of the table you're sitting on. So let me break this down. Everything we covered lands differently depending on whether you're buying your first home, selling a lot with hidden potential, sitting on a property you already own, or looking for your next investment. If you're buying, start looking at lots differently than you used to. A property with room for a second unit or one that sits near a real transit stop might carry more upside than the house alone suggests. Site limits are real, and they can kill a project that looked great on paper. And remember, the buyer-broker agreement conversation happens up front now, so know what you're signing before you tour your first home with a new agent. If you're selling, your buyer pool may now include people looking at your property for its development potential, not just as a place to live. That can work in your favor, but only if you understand your zoning well enough to answer those questions when they come up. If you're selling a condo, price it with the current inventory picture in mind so it is the most attractive condo on the market. The first couple of weeks in the market are more important than ever in that segment. If you're a current homeowner watching all this unfold, know that an ADU is a real investment decision, not a quick win. A unit lot subdivision is also an option if you ever want to sell a backyard cottage separately down the road. So keep an eye on whether your block falls inside one of the new growth areas too, because that can shift what your neighbors end up building next door. And if you're thinking like an investor, the math has shifted in your favor in a few specific ways. No owner occupancy requirement, 2 units instead of 1, and a clear path to selling a unit off separately. Higher inventory in the condo segment could also mean better entry points if you understand the HOA finances going in. So back to that downtown or South Lake Union buyer, right? If that's where you currently are, but you're looking at properties with ADU potential near a transit stop, they need to run the numbers with a contractor before committing to anything. Be excited about the opportunity for sure, but do the homework first. That's the kind of buyer these new rules tend to help. All right, so in conclusion, the rule book keeps changing and the property owners paying attention now are the ones getting ahead of the next round before it lands. Everything else will still be working off the old rules after the new ones are already in place. If you want a straight read on what your specific lot, ADU, or listing can do under these new rules, email me at hello@mwagnerteam.com today. I'll walk you through your property with you and help you understand what may be possible. And if you're trying to figure out which Seattle neighborhood to buy in before the new infrastructure value gets priced in, the video I've linked walks through where I'd be looking. All right, I'll see you on the next one.